This is Democracy Watch. Mark, we have a major update from a judge who is deciding whether or not to release the grand jury transcripts from the Epstein files. I'm going to put the quote from the judge right up here on the screen. A member of the public, appreciating that the Maxwell grand jury materials do not contribute anything to public knowledge, might conclude that the government's motion for their unsealing was aimed not at transparency, but at diversion, aimed not at full disclosure, but at the illusion of such. So first and foremost, can I have your reaction to a judge coming out and basically giving up the game on Trump's behalf in terms of why he was looking to release the transcripts from these grand jury testimonies from the Epstein files?
Yeah, I mean, look, the judge called it straight up what happened here, which is that Donald Trump and Pam Bondi and who the hell knows who else in that administration, decided they'd try to pull a fast one up the American public. They'd say we're going to move to have the grand jury transcripts released, knowing full well that those transcripts do not contain much at all, which is, by the way, not unusual in our system. Prosecutors tend to only put before the grand jury the minimum amount of information and evidence necessary to get an indictment. So they may collect, 5,000 boxes of documents, but they'll only put before the grand jury, one or two witnesses that talk about three or four of the documents. So this was always a setup, and it is great to see a federal judge calling it out as such. It's also, though, important to recognize that Donald Trump could still release the Epstein files, right? So This judge said they're not going to release the grand jury transcripts, which are subject to grand jury secrecy, and as the judge points out, in this case, wouldn't be illuminating, but that wouldn't prevent the Department of Justice from releasing, I imagine, just an enormous avalanche of other materials that they have that are not covered by those rules.
Of which the summaries from these grand jury testimonies are included, right? And so if they really wanted transparency as it relates to these grand jury testimonies, which are just a small fraction, maybe 5%, 10% of what's included in the broader tranche of Epstein files, if they really wanted that stuff released, they already have summaries of it at their disposal, don't they?
Well, they have better than that. I mean, essentially, the way that criminal investigations work in terms of witness testimony is that FBI agents interview a lot of people, right? They interview every witness, every potential witness. They chase down leads. They collect documents, right? They are out doing the spade work of figuring out who did what to who and how and who might have seen what. And they do that. And all of those interviews get recorded. They get written up as summary interviews. Okay. So there is a summary of every interview that gets written up. You sometimes hear the term FBI 302. That's what these are called. That's the form number that these things are written up on. And ultimately, the prosecutors and the FBI agents go through all of the mountain of information that they gather in those interview summaries. And then they decide, what is it that we actually need the grand jury to hear? And so sometimes they may hear a little piece from one or two witnesses who were interviewed for hours, right? They may have been interviewed for 8 hours. So there's a witness interview summary that can go on for pages upon pages upon pages. And then they'll be like, okay, well, let's just take that witness and put them in the grand jury for 10 minutes or 15 minutes or for an hour to just provide a portion of that testimony for the grand jury. Sometimes they don't even put the witness in. They'll just put the FBI agent in. Say, I conducted this investigation. I interviewed all these people, and this is basically what I found. But those raw summaries of interviews are where all of the information that you'd want to know about who is in the Epstein files, right? Because that is the FBI collecting all of the information. So when we talk about the Epstein files, one of the big tranches of information are these summaries of interviews conducted by FBI agents, written down by FBI agents. And none of that, to be clear, none of it is protected by grand jury secrecy rules. All of it is at the fingertips of Kash Patel, Dan Bongino, and Pam Bondi. Okay. They literally could press a button on their computer and it would just all appear. Okay. And the fact that they are not releasing those tells you everything you need to know about what's in there. Now, obviously, you'd want to redact the names of the victims, right? If they interviewed a woman who was or girl that was a victim, we'd redact her name, or if they referred to others, you redact their name. But otherwise, this would be very, very easy to produce. And that's before you get, by the way, to all the records that they may have seized from Epstein, his own email, his own documents, calendars, stuff that Maxwell may have had, stuff that the girls and women may have given to the FBI. That's where you get to the documents. Just on the testimony interview front, that would be low-hanging fruit that in the course of a few days they could compile and they could put on the internet, or they could put them in those fancy binders that they put the bullshit documents into and hand them out at the White House. But Donald Trump doesn't want that. And you know why, and I know why he doesn't want that.
Right. Well, look, I think it's beyond clear why they even went this route to get grand jury testimonies, knowing full well that judges aren't going to release it unless there's some legal reason to do so. But it's not customary, nor do they have the authority to be able to release these grand jury testimonies. And if they really did want this stuff out, again, they would just release it themselves. But this has still become a really potent talking point on the right, to be able to scapegoat a judge and say, oh, look, there you have, Donald Trump wants transparency. He claims that he wants transparency. He even went to the court to get these things unsealed. It's the communist Marxist judges who are covering up for the Clintons and their pals, these Democratic billionaires. And so that's the talking point that we see. And so when we see that online, for example, when we see it on Twitter, or any of these online spaces, what would your reaction, your response to those people be who are making this claim by suggesting that Trump wants transparency and in fact that it's the judges who are burying this stuff?
All right, everybody needs to pay attention to this. Right now, the FBI, Kash Patel, and the Department of Justice, Pam Bondi, and therefore, for all practical purposes, the White House and Donald Trump, have gone through all of these records. We know that, right? There have been various press reports in which FBI agents were dispatched to work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, to go through every last Epstein file. And what they did at the White House, what they did at the FBI, what they did with Pam Bondi, is they then basically said, we have two categories of stuff. On one hand, we have tens of thousands of pages of interview notes, of interview summaries, and other source documents that we could release tomorrow. And guess what? Donald Trump's name is in a number of those documents. I'm not here to say how it's in there or what it says he did, but I think it's safe to assume his name is in those documents. Then they said, now we have this other group of documents, which is like 3 or 4 documents, 3 or 4 transcripts of 3 or 4 witnesses who appeared before a grand jury, which, by the way, a judge is not going to let us to release anyway. But Donald Trump's name's not in those documents. So what we're going to do is we're going to tell the American public we're releasing these. We're releasing the 3 or 4 documents the judge won't allow to be released anyway, but are totally sanitized because that's what we put before a grand jury. It doesn't mention Donald Trump. While we are going to hide the boxes upon boxes, the reams and reams of paper where Donald Trump's name appears. And they think you're stupid enough, everyone, that they're going to pull this off. You can't let them do it. Okay? They're hiding the ball in plain sight. If they want to release the Epstein files, all they need to do is release the Epstein files. Now, you then wouldn't get the 3 or 4 grand jury transcripts that aren't telling you anything anyway, but you're getting the interviews of those witnesses, you're getting those interviews of a lot of other witnesses, and you're getting a lot of other stuff. This is a con game by a con man enabled by Pam Bondi, Kash Patel, and the rest of them.
Mark, can you speak about how useful those grand jury testimonies are even going to be? Because don't they just rely on lending themselves to the convictions of the people for whom those testimonies were about? So in this case, if it was Ghislaine Maxwell, you wouldn't necessarily even expect any information from anybody else because this was to seek the conviction of one person in particular, a conviction, by the way, that was successful. And so there's not that much more information we need on the culpability of Ghislaine Maxwell here because they got her. She's serving out a 20-year prison sentence. And so what can we really learn from unsealing the grand jury testimony about someone who is already convicted and incarcerated when it's expressly not her? It's the other people that we're trying to find information about.
Yeah, so you're exactly right that what would have been put for the grand jury would have only related to the target of the investigation, the person who they wanted to indict. But I also want to reemphasize this point. Even as to that person, it wouldn't be all the evidence. In other words, if you're a prosecutor and you're going to prosecute Ghislaine Maxwell, and you have 30 girls who could testify that she was involved in illegal trafficking or illegal activity, you're not going to put 30 of them before the grand jury and put them under oath and have them provide sworn, transcribed testimony. Why? Because then Ghislaine Maxwell at trial is going to know exactly what they're going to say and is going to be able to use their transcripts to cross-examine them. So instead, what you're going to do is you may pick one girl, two girls, and put them before the grand jury and then just ask the specific questions necessary to return an indictment, right? So rather than, asking them 2 hours of questions, you're just going to ask 30 minutes of questions so that you have just the bare minimum that you need so that you're not creating a lot of prior statements under oath that could then be used by Ghislaine Maxwell at trial. So yes.
So by design, you're not getting the full breadth of the information. You're
Correct.
Just getting what you need to be able to secure an indictment so that the grand jury can vote that indictment out, and then you do the full thing at the actual trial.
Correct. That's exactly right. So the way the system works is FBI uses a very broad funnel to collect, but those interviews are summaries of interviews. They're not direct quotations. They're not transcripts, right? So you have that, and you have a lot of raw documents. Then the prosecutors put the bare minimum before the grand jury in order to secure an indictment. And then at trial, you get a much broader picture again, sworn testimony, cross-examination, and the like. That's just how the criminal justice system works in the United States. There are lots of reasons to say that, this is not a fair system for defendants. I could imagine people listening to this saying, well, that doesn't sound very fair for a criminal defendant. And there are a lot of people in the criminal justice system who say, that's exactly right. All of this information should have to go before the grand jury. But it doesn't. That isn't the system. And so if Donald Trump wants the Epstein files released, if Kash Patel wants to make good on his promise and Bongino's promise to release the Epstein files, if Pam Bondi wants to make good on her promise to release the Epstein files, there is all of this material that could be released, and none of it is covered by grand jury secrecy because none of it was testimony before the grand jury. It was summaries of interviews given to FBI agents in people's houses, in government buildings, in coffee shops, wherever it is, but it wasn't in the grand jury room.
Right. Well, look, I think all of this underscores the fact that you have been especially clear-eyed in cutting through the bullshit here and focusing on the very distinct distraction that Donald Trump is trying to put forward with Epstein. And so highly recommend for everybody who's watching right now, if you are not subscribed yet to Mark's YouTube channel, it costs nothing to subscribe, but it's a great way to elevate his voice, which has never been more important than it is right now. So I'm going to put the link to Democracy Docket, that YouTube channel, right here on the screen, and also in the post description of this video. Again, if you're not yet subscribed, hit the subscribe button. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
I'm Mark Elias.
This is Democracy Watch.